LLC, PestGeek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen Van Tassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the PestGeek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I'm doing okay. We're coming in here in the end of July, looking at the doorway to August, and we don't have too much smoke here in Montana. So we had a little bit of smoke there for a while, but it looks like it's kind of cleared out. But we do have some fires. It is fire season in Montana, and that can always be kind of a miserable time. But nevertheless, we're going to enjoy the better weather while we have it and the cleaner air while we have it. So hope your week is going well as well, and that your business is doing okay, and that you're being safe out there, both in terms of the heat and in terms of your ladder safety. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, make sure that if you can give us a 5-star review, we would be most grateful. For those of you that don't want to use YouTube, you can certainly get my podcast from Rumble, where you can just go to Wildlife Control Consultant, and you will find the podcast there. In fact, I'm always publishing. In fact, I usually publish faster on Rumble than I do with YouTube, because I don't have control of that particular page with YouTube. Nevertheless, if you have suggestions, criticisms, thoughts about the show, you can definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can reach me there. Also, you can visit us on Facebook, and so join the revolution, as Franklin calls it. So you can join our PestGeek Podcast page and group, where you can share with other wildlife control operators and also pest control operators as well, your triumphs and your trials, and just saying hello. We'd be glad to have you there as well. Well, this week I thought I would talk a little bit about the need for research, particularly something that is either peer edited or peer reviewed. Now, if you've been following my podcast for a while, you know that I've had a previous podcast where I discussed the different types of academic research on products. So there's sort of a hierarchy of terms of the quality. So at the highest level, you have what's called peer reviewed research, and at the next level, it's peer edited. Then you have trade magazines, and then below that you have anecdotal and personal experience. So one of the challenges within our industry is we lack the resources, translate resources as money, to do the kind of rigorous research on some of our control methods that I would say the people involved in the pest control industry does. The reason is as trophic levels. Now, trophic levels are basically, it's a phrase for how food and energy move through the food chain, right? So you have at the bottom of it all, you have plants, and then you have insects that eat the plants, and then you have animals that eat the insects, and then you have other animals that eat those animals that eat the insects. So the higher up you go in the food chain, the fewer animals there are. And so there's always going to be fewer vertebrate animals than there are insects. And there's going to be fewer insects than there are plants, because every time you jump a level, there's a loss of energy through heat. And so one of the challenges, what that means for us, is that there's always going to be more money in the area of bugs than there is in the area of vertebrates. In fact, as a rule of thumb, if the industry for pest control is $1 billion, then the industry for vertebrate control would be about $100 million. So we're always about 1/10 of the size of the insect pest control industry. Now, what that means is that companies that provide you chemicals to control insects are going to have significantly higher volumes of money than those companies that provide resources to help us control vertebrates. So we lack the money to do some of the type of research necessary for some of our techniques. And so we have to rely sometimes on anecdotal information, maybe some very small pilot studies, things that don't have necessarily the rigor that would be required to get a peer-reviewed article. Nevertheless, we do need to encourage more people to get involved in rigorous research. Sometimes people think it's really expensive to do rigorous research, and it can be. There's no doubt about that. However, there are ways to crowdsource information and to share ideas and experiences so that we may not have quality information in the sense of something that could be peer-reviewed, but we would have enough information that's crowdsourced to say, yeah, this works, or B, this doesn't work, or C, if it does work, how does it not work? How does it work? Let me give an illustration. Does anyone deny that trapping to control a particular wildlife problem doesn't work? Right? If you have squirrels in an attic, trapping those squirrels and removing them works. I don't think there's any. Do you really need a peer-reviewed article to demonstrate that that works? Probably not, right? So, I mean, it's just sort of obvious. Problem was there. We trapped the squirrels, removed the squirrels. The problem is gone. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Let's say I have XYZ chemical and I scored it up in the attic. Let's just say it's, we have permission from the EPA to do the type of research. We're able to get into a trial program. It's a minimal risk pesticide, so there's a lot less rigmarole in terms of paperwork. Just bear with me here. Don't have a conniption fit because we're just talking about a chemical, right? For those of you that don't know, a frightening device is a non-chemical treatment. Things like audible, visual, audio visual, like firecrackers, that would be an audio visual. That's a non-chemical way of frightening an animal away. Where a repellent is a chemical form to get an animal away. You have taste repellents, biological repellents. You have frightening repellents, and so there's different types of things that can be used in terms of the area of repellent. So let's say you go up and go squirt, 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 and the manufacturer is telling you that this solves squirrel problems. Would you believe it? Why? Why or why not? Would you trust the manufacturer to their information that it worked, or would you have to try it yourself? This is one of the challenges that we have in our industry. The reason why I bring this up is I've been dialoguing with an individual who will remain nameless, but he has a product that he or she believes very strongly in, and I've been basically saying, show me the evidence. So let's call it XYZ repellent. And the person says that they've sold a lot of this particular product. People have been very successful with it, that he has or she has various experience with this particular product, and it's just outstanding. And I said, my response was, great, then where is the evidence for it? And she referred me to a particular website. And I'm like, well, anecdotal information is good to a point because you don't know what the quality of that anecdotal information. And the person said, well, a major pest control company has been using it and everything is hunky-dory, and why would they be purchasing it again? And I'm thinking to myself, well, some of you in the audience might know that there are various companies that will necessarily use repellents that are allegedly work well, and but from the literature that they don't work. I mean, how many of us, let's just throw mothballs under the bus, for example, how many of us have been to jobs where we've had the client throwing mothballs all over the place, allegedly it's going to repel the world, and we're still there removing the animal, right? That's the problem. So even if I assume all the information this manufacturer is getting is accurate, the problem is that I still have to trust her to be giving me all the information, right? Not the negative information. And here's the problem. This is something that we often, whenever you're hearing things online or you're seeing from a company, customer satisfaction, you have to be careful with that, because a lot of people will not return a product. I'm one of those types of people. My wife is so much better about this than I am. If I purchase a product and I'm not happy with it, I typically just don't return it. And I'm not alone in that. Very few people, a very small portion of the population, will go through the hassle to return a product that they're not happy with. They just won't buy it again. Now, that's not always fair to the manufacturer, to be sure, but sometimes a manufacturer can get a heightened sense of confidence in their product because from their perspective, they're not getting negative feedback. And if they're getting certain clients that are using it repeatedly, do we have the information necessary to know what situations that client is using it for? Let me illustrate. Every trap, let's just use traps for an example. Every trap has has a process by which it should be properly used. Not every trap can be used in every situation. So one of the problems with repellents or with frightening devices or with traps is that if someone says, well, I tried this and it didn't work, is it because the product is just garbage, or was the product not used in an appropriate situation? This is one of the challenges with repellents. For example, we know for a fact that there are several deer repellents that clearly work. They don't work 100%, however. Even under the best circumstances, they don't. They might in your specific situation, but overall, they don't work 100% of the time. So, but if you're that one client who is in the perfect situation, squirting a particular repellent on a plant, and you're saying, I have no more deer damage, that doesn't necessarily translate to someone else. It could be an issue of population density, that there could be an abundance of food available. Perhaps there's heavy deer pressure. Perhaps there's heavy hunting pressure. Perhaps the owner didn't tell you about the dog that they have roaming in their backyard. That's also keeping deer away. You see the confounding issues. So this is one of the challenges. So as I'm communicating with this manufacturer, I'm trying to subtly point out to them that I understand that they believe in their product, but their belief isn't necessarily evidence to me. And that is, it's a biased opinion. It's not that bias is inherently wrong or that they're lying. It's that their perspective is clouded. There's a conflict of interest there. I would rather have a third party evaluate the product and give me information. So the manufacturer referred me to a couple of websites. Okay, that's well and good. The problem is that will those websites or will those businesses provide me with the detailed information about the efficacy and weaknesses of the particular product that they're using? That's assuming I can even get a hold of them. This is one of the reasons why we need published material. The word publication comes from the concept of making something public. When you publish an article detailing your experience with a particular product, you open up that information for other people to evaluate the argument, the logic of your argument, the nature of your research and the nature of your experience. This is the challenge. Having had a few peer-reviewed articles published, I can tell you it's like getting, sometimes, not always, I want to be careful how I phrase this, sometimes it feels like you're getting a colonoscopy. It can be quite brutal. I have been on the other side of peer-reviewed articles where I was a reviewer for articles, and you're basically trying to tear that article down, not to be mean, not to just be vindictive, but you're trying to ask questions that perhaps the author didn't answer. You're trying to evaluate the author's argument. Was this concept clear? Did their conclusion follow from their data? Was there other elements or confounding clues that would make their conclusion less certain? And that's what you do. That's the peer-reviewed process. It's quite painful. And if you don't believe me, just think about the time when someone criticizes an idea you have. That feeling you get, that defensiveness, is what happens in academic literature. At least it should, right? So as I'm trying to communicate with this manufacturer about the need for publication, of course, it all boils down to money. It can be expensive to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. I get that. But there's other ways to publish information that doesn't require anywhere near the amount of expense. For example, the Vertebrate Pest Conference. The Vertebrate Pest Conference proceedings are peer-edited, and there's no page charges for it. In other types of journal articles where you're getting peer-reviewed publications, there often are page charges. Where you say, what's a page charge? It's where you're paying the journal a certain amount of money to have your article published in the journal. Generally, that money covers the typesetting necessary to get the article in proper format to be published in the journal. And that can be kind of expensive. It could be $250 a page. And so how many typewritten pages is that? It could be anywhere from, I think, 2 to 3 typewritten pages to create one published page, because font sizes are different and how things are laid out. But if you have an article that's going to be 3 or 4 pages long in the journal, that could be close to $1,000 or more. And, that's not counting the amount of effort you've had to make just to write the article, go through the review process, and plus the research data you would have to even get to that level. So it can be quite an investment in terms of time and money, not to mention expertise. The Vertebrate Pest Conference is only peer-edited, and so it's a much lower standard. So you can use personal anecdotal information and compile that. I did it for an article that I did on M44s, for example, is I took information that was submitted to me by people who use M44s, and then I compiled that information. Now, their information is, I couldn't vet their information. I wasn't there when they did it. However, they are under threat of legal sanction if they're discovered to have been lying, right? So there is that. But nevertheless, it's information that they reported. And so I was able to compile that over, I think, 14 years. And then I published that information as well as my evaluation of the data that was received from that. Now, someone could certainly do that with their own experience. A manufacturer who's having contact with a lot of clients, for example, could do the same thing, have sort of a survey form, follow up with people, get permission to use their information, and simply compile the type of data to, like, what type of houses was it used in? What kind of animals was it used on? How effective was it for those particular animals? When did it not work? How long did it take to work? How did you have to readjust the use of the particular product or method to get the desired results? All those types of things, and then you can compile that information and then start drawing some conclusions so that you can determine when that product should be used or when that product should not be used. I hope that's kind of making some sense for you. So when you find me not necessarily touting a particular method or a particular product, there could be some reasons for that. One, I may not be aware of it. Two, I may be aware of information that questions the validity of that material. I think I did a presentation in the past on ultrasound, for example. Ultrasound has very limited efficacy information. There is a small amount of information that tells us that, for example, rodents seem to avoid areas where ultrasound is being played. But that's a far cry from saying ultrasound will drive rodents out of a structure. Do you see how subtle that is? So this is one of the challenges that we have when we talk about a particular product or a particular method. What exactly does the manufacturer mean by work versus what you as a professional define as work? When is a product effective or is a product not effective? If I told you that doing ABC method would work 50% of the time, is that enough for you to use it in your own business, or would you be much more hesitant to use it, or would you use it as a last resort? Does the product not work if it was effective 50% of the time? Or is that effective? And so one of the challenges is, I've talked about deer repellents, I believe, in my previous podcast. If not, I certainly will in the future. But when we talk about repellents, is a 50% efficacy rate, is that effective or is that ineffective? So what do we mean by even the concept of work? So let me I know I'm throwing a lot out there about questions, but I'm trying to help you understand why it's so important for us to have research published in our field of wildlife damage management, and why it's so important, and why I always respect manufacturers who go through the pain and the potential downside of exposing their product to outside research. That someone's going to come in and use a product. I'll give an illustration. I was sent one time a particular carbon monoxide generating device. Sent to me free of charge. Okay. I was able to use the product in the field. Actually, I've been able to use it on 2 different research projects. Now, the manufacturer had no control over my findings or anything like that, but it certainly helped them when I'm going to be publishing information. In fact, I actually did 3 studies. I published 1 of them already, and I'm looking to publish 2 more. But nevertheless, that manufacturer didn't know what I was going to come up with. And it turns out that for a couple of species, the product works, I would think, great. Another species, however, the product really loses its efficacy, or in terms of its efficiency, not efficacy, I should say efficiency, and that someone wishing to use the product needs to understand that if they're going to use it effectively, it's going to take a lot more time than maybe they want to use. But by publishing this information, I'm going to put that out there for other people to evaluate. Maybe there is a better way to use the product than what I was using it as. This is the problem. So let's go over the challenges of using anecdotal information from the manufacturer. Number 1, we're always concerned about bias. Would the manufacturer give us the bad news? Not every manufacturer would. Now, I don't know whether this particular manufacturer that I was talking to would or not. All I know is that everything's blue sky and roses with this particular product. Okay, where's the data? Where's the research? I want to know more about it before I begin to tout that particular method. Number two, the problem with anecdotal information is it often skews one direction. I told you the challenge of the problem of returns. If someone said, like, for example, I had one manufacturer I did some testing for, and they were very angry about my results. My results were garbage, actually, but she didn't figure that out. And they were extremely angry at me and said, and he told me, if you're wondering why I keep using different genders, it's because I don't want you to know who it is. So you don't know whether it's a male I talk to, whether it's a female I talk to, so whether it's a repellent, whether it's a method. So I want this to be not traceable back to a particular. But anyways, some research that I did, and the person told me that they had never had negative feedback about their product. Okay, assuming that's true, what was interesting is I talked to a friend of theirs, and that person told me that every time they used it, it never worked. Now, why didn't that information get back to the manufacturer? Well, the reason is he didn't want to lose the friendship. But he told me that it didn't work for him. So this is the problem of just simply relying on manufacturer testimony. I'm not suggesting that the manufacturers are lying, although it's theoretically possible that some would bury negative information or just say, well, it's such a small amount, it's not relevant. Because we all know that there's always a couple people out there that give negative reviews on everything, right? So, and that there could be a case for that. The other challenge, of course, is so we have the problem of anecdotal information in bias. The next problem is that there's the need for tough questions. And that is sometimes you'll read things, oh, I tried this and it worked great. All right, how did you use it? What did you mean by it worked? I mean, because I'll have people tell me that they used mothballs, threw the mothballs under the deck, and the skunks went away. Now, did the mothballs drive the skunk away? Or was it the fact that the skunk got hit by a car 2 streets over that caused the skunk not to come back? Does that make sense? So sometimes we think that just because I do X and Y happens, we assume that X caused Y. You may have heard this, you may be sick of it, but it's still true. Correlation does not prove causation. What that means is just because A occurs near B, that A caused B. Let me give an illustration. I could say something like, people that eat carrots are associated with mass murder. And you're like, what? Yeah, we could do a survey of mass murderers, and lo and behold, they all eat carrots. And you're like, well, I eat carrots and I haven't murdered anybody. But all I did was point out a correlation, right? Because eating carrots is not really associated with being a mass murderer, right? But I could say it's correlated. Okay? So correlation, just because 2 things happen doesn't mean they're connected in a causal relationship. Perhaps there are products, it could be, this is why you have in research studies what's called a control and the experiment. For example, one product that I did some study on, we used water as well as, and for some people we told them to use water in part of their study, and then we had the active ingredient in another part of their study. The idea is we wanted to compare, and it turned out that water sometimes was a repellent. You say, well, was water really the repellent? And the answer is, of course not. We don't believe water was the repellent. We believe that the human presence was the repellent. That when the animal discovered that their den was discovered by a human, as demonstrated by the spraying of water, that caused them to move on, right? And so this is why you have a control. But without a publication to engage with, it's hard to evaluate someone's conclusions, because a good article shows you the data. and how they came to their conclusion. When did they use the product? How did they use the product? What was the manner that they used the product in? Time of year, did that matter? Does a product work better in the winter as opposed in the spring, right? So publication is so critical on this point. The bottom line is, I want you as wildlife damage managers, as vertebrate pest specialists, to think critically about some of the claims that manufacturers make about their product. Doesn't mean you're going to be a cynic where you're just always doubting people. What I'm saying is we need to be thinking critically. Let's evaluate the claims and say, is this true? If it is true, how is it true? In what way is it true? And that, because I do think we need to move our industry forward into sort of compiling the best information we have for exclusion, for any repellents, for frightening devices, for different types of trapping methods. I think we need to have some of that self-critical evaluation for the use of one-way doors even. How effective are these methods? And when we consider them to be effective, what is the context with which makes them effective? And by the way, what definition are we using when we say they're effective? What's the time period? So keep that in mind when we're evaluating manufacturers. And so if you're wondering, why hasn't Stephen talked about this? Well, it could be that I'm not aware of it. Number two, it could be that the research I'm aware of trashes it, or I have some serious doubts about its efficacy, or there's just a lack of information about it. So for those of you that are manufacturers out there, if you have a particular product, I welcome you on my show. I have invited this manufacturer to come onto my show. I did warn the individual that this would be a frank and probing conversation. So I don't believe in blindsiding my guests. If you're ever a guest in my show, you know that I try to be very thoughtful, very careful. I'm not here to trash your particular method or ideology or something like that. But for this particular person, I wanted to be clear that I will be asking tough questions, because I'm happy to believe in various methods if people can demonstrate to me that it works. Now, if you don't believe me, oh, Stephen, you're just saying that, you're trying to be above it all. Let me give an illustration. I was not really that impressed with the concept of one-way doors until I was employed by an individual that used them. And he had to teach me how to use one-way doors. And I was not very good at it. I just want to throw that out there. I was not very good at it. But in terms of my recollection, I had at least a 40% efficacy rate with one-way doors. And you say, well, Stephen, 40% wasn't very, very good. I understand. However, I didn't put in a lot of them, but it showed me that it could work. And I know that there are other people out there that have much higher success rates. I'm also aware that there are certain species of animals that one-way doors have a significantly higher rate of efficacy. Let me give an illustration. Flying squirrels are certainly one. Bats, of course, everyone's using one-way doors on bats. If you're not, you need to learn. Gray squirrels are a little tougher. I would assume fox squirrels are too, although I've never used a one-way door on a fox squirrel. I've even been told that raccoons are actually easier than squirrels. I don't have direct experience with that, but the person was someone that I trusted. But nevertheless, it just shows you that with the right data, with the right information, with the right tips, minds can be changed, but you have to be willing, and a lot of people are just a little too emotionally brittle to expose their information to critical review. And by critical, I don't mean just judgmental, just nitpicking for the sake of being nitpicking. It's where your ideas are going to be going through the cauldron to purify them, to make them worth more, or to see if they stand the test of a critical awareness. That's the challenge, and it's painful and it's risky, particularly if you're making money on a product. The last thing you want is negative information to come out on it. I'll give another illustration here as I wrap up. I was doing a story on a particular beaver trap, and it was relatively new beaver trap, or at least it was new to me, I should probably say, but I think it was relatively new. And I reached out to a distributor that was selling the product, and I said, look, I'm looking to do a story on your particular trap. And I said, one of the questions I always ask manufacturers is, when would you not use your product? Or what situations are not appropriate for your product? Now, I think of that as a very innocuous question. And the distributor says, I don't know if I can really answer that. I'll have to call the manufacturer. I said, man, what do you mean that? What do you mean you have to call the manufacturer to see? Well, I don't know if you'll want that info. That sounds too negative. And I thought, that's pretty sad, because no trap is effective in every situation or appropriate for every situation. I mean, if I said putting a conibear over a doggy door in someone's house because a raccoon went through it once, would you think that's an appropriate use of a conibear? I hope not, because the likelihood of you catching a dog or a cat going through that are pretty high, as opposed to catching the raccoon, right? So is that the trap's fault, or is that the user's fault, right? So it just struck me as very odd, and I never did get that story written. But it told me something about sometimes manufacturers are just way too brittle. And that's a problem for our industry. And so something should withstand the test of time. It should be able to withstand that criticism. And it's risky for people who have their financial well-being tied up into something. And so if you're looking to design something, if you're looking to manufacture something, now you understand why it's so hard to do. Because if it works, how does it work? And will something else beat it? And will it stand the test of time, and that sort of thing? Well, I hope this has been helpful. Again, kind of geeky, not necessarily going to put more money in your pocket, but it does tell us as professionals that we need to be thinking clearly about the products we use and how we evaluate information, anecdotal or otherwise, and why we need to, as an industry, be supporting publications more so we can elevate the level of our work and push the boundaries so that we get out of the same rut. I mean, it's very pleasing to me to see more individuals using one-way doors. I remember the day when people were talking about one-way doors and you were ridiculed. That's not the case anymore. We've come a long way in that sort of 30 years, but the reality is that the industry has been changing slowly, understandably. It shouldn't be revolutionary, but it does mean that the industry can change if you bring the data along. And I want to encourage manufacturers out there whose products are maybe not well adopted by the industry. The way to do that is to let your product be put to the test in a very rigorous way. That way people can know when to use it, when not to use it, how to use it. And then they'll have the confidence to talk about your product in an appropriate manner, assuming it passes. Well, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the PestGeek Podcast family. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. Do drop me a line. I would love to hear from you at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your criticisms, and, perhaps even your stories. I am looking for a few individuals who would be willing to review my book on the update that I've done on a particular book on the Vertebrate Pest Handbook, which was that I've revised. I'm looking for people to give it a critical review. And so if you're interested in that, drop me an email with your full contact information. It's about 150 pages, but it's in a question and answer format. So it's not like you're reading reams of text. It's basically a volume full of questions related to commensal rodents to help business owners have quizzes for their workers, or as a very rapid way to cover a variety of information about commensal rodents in digestible chunks of information. So that's kind of how the book is designed. I would love to get some additional critical feedback on it. Before, what you get for it is you would get an acknowledgement in the book should you want your name to be listed. I will then send you a copy when it is ultimately published, as well as repay you for the shipping cost of shipping the reviewed copy back to me with your notes and scribbles and criticisms in the book. So again, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. So again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Living the wildlife. Why do we call it living the wildlife? Well, we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.